Hello and welcome. I'm Ron Duncan Hart of the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series, and today we have Professor Asher Susser, who will be talking about Israel and the evolving current situation in the region. And next month he will return to talk about the future for Israel. Even with the Abrahamic Accords, there are critical challenges for Israel, and Professor Susser is an important analyst to help us understand where we are and what is coming for the country. Register for next month's talk at santafedls.org. Today, Dr. Bonnie Ellinger, retired faculty member from Brandeis University, will introduce Professor Susser. Dr. Ellinger.
Thank you, Ron. Good morning, good evening, Asher in Israel. Asher Susser is Professor Emeritus of Middle Eastern History at Tel Aviv University, where he taught for over 35 years. In addition, he was the director of the Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies at Tel Aviv University for 12 years, has been a Fulbright Fellow, a visiting professor at Cornell, the University of Chicago, and Brandeis University, as well as the Stein Family Professor of Modern Israel Studies at the University of Arizona. The author of many scholarly works, his most recent book is on the emergence of the modern Middle East, published in 2017. Professor Susser's online course of that same title has been taken by some 120,000 students in over 160 countries. I am delighted to welcome Professor Asher Susser to the Santa Fe Distinguished Lecture Series.
Thank you very much, Bonnie, for your very kind introduction. And I feel very privileged to be speaking to this very prestigious group of people in Santa Fe and in other parts of the US. And so I'm very glad to be here with you. Speaking about Israel's place in a radically changing region, I would start with a major historical change that has taken place in this part of the world as we've known it for very many years. For much of the 20th century, it was very common to refer to the Middle East as the Arab world, or to refer to the Arab world as the Middle East, as if these were two interchangeable terms that meant more or less the same thing. But that is no longer true. The Middle East is no longer the Arab world. And it's no longer the Arab world because the main states in the Middle East that dominate the region are not Arab states. There are three states that dominate the Middle East: Turkey, Iran, and Israel, none of which is an Arab state, as we know. Turkey and Iran in the 1950s and the 1960s used to be referred to as the periphery of the Middle East. One would hardly say that today. It's not Turkey and Iran that are the periphery, but very much at the core and the center of things as they evolve today. So things have changed dramatically from one end to the other. Israel's founding fathers were a rather pessimistic lot. And coming from where they came from and going through what they had gone through, it's hardly surprising. After the war of 1948, from which Israel emerged victorious, but having suffered enormous casualties in proportion to its small population, Ben-Gurion looked to the future, arguing in his diary that the victory of 1948 was no guarantee for the future. And he looked at the world around him with much concern and fear. Israel was this great monument to Arab defeat. And Israel believed that it was the epitome of historical justice. Israel's narrative speaks of from Holocaust to redemption, which is we, the Jewish people, went within the short space of 3 years from 1945 to 1948. But from the Arab point of view, this was not historical justice, but exactly the opposite. A great historical injustice, they believed. Israel's creation was their defeat and their catastrophe. And they spoke like in a boxing match. Having lost the first round, they said, there will be a second round. And surely in the second round, we, the Arabs, will emerge victorious. There are more of us. We have greater wealth. And we will modernize and defeat the Israelis. And Ben-Gurion and his generation were deeply concerned that the 2 million or so people that gathered in Israel in the early years would not be able to face up to the 40 million or so Arabs around Israel, more numerous, wealthier, aligning themselves with the Soviet Union in the Cold War. New revolutionary regimes headed by the officers of the armies in the various Arab countries, that Israel would not be able to keep up its military advantage. That eventually, in terms of conventional warfare, Israel would become weaker and weaker in comparison to the greater Arab strength. And it is for that reason that Israel in the late 1950s chose to create a nuclear option in the belief that in conventional terms, Israel would not be able to face the music. But things turned out entirely differently. Ben-Gurion's pessimism was misplaced entirely. The crushing defeat of the Arabs in the 1967 war, the Six-Day War as we like to call it, ushered in not endless war, but peace. Peace with the Arab states, peace with Egypt, peace with Jordan. And now we speak of the Abraham Accords. The Arabs didn't get stronger and stronger in comparison to Israel. In fact, they got weaker and weaker. And Israel got stronger and stronger in comparison to the Arabs. So we achieved peace and not war. But peace had and has its limitations. The Arabs, in making their peace with Israel, did not accept Israel's historical legitimacy. They acquiesced in the balance of power. They understood that Israel was simply too strong to defeat. Not that it was legitimate. And therefore, we always had the difficulty of creating what we called with the Arab states normalization. We didn't want just peace. We wanted normalization. That is, to accept us, to accept Israel as a normal, natural member of the Middle Eastern family of nations, that we are a legitimate part of the region. But we never got that. We did get peace, and it's real peace. But being in acquiescence in the balance of power, it taught us a lesson. If we do not remain more powerful than the neighborhood, if we do not maintain our military edge, the peace will not last. And the Arabs would come to us, the Egyptians, for example, and urge us to abandon Israel's military option, to abandon Israel's nuclear capacity. After all, the Egyptians would say, we have peace. And Israel would say, well, but we don't have normalization. And we have peace with Egypt and Jordan, but not with the rest. And there are other parts of the neighborhood who maintain their hostility towards Israel. We cannot give up this advantage. And they would return and say, you see, you people don't really want peace. You want hegemony and domination. And therefore we will not normalize with you. And therefore the vicious circle of peace without normalization, without final and full acceptance. We have to be on our guard. And in the meantime, from the early years, Israel developed a military doctrine which had to deal primarily with Israel's huge disadvantage in size, geographic size, and population size. Small, vulnerable, relative to the region. So we developed a military doctrine based on a number of principles. Preemption. Never to be attacked first if you can help it. Never to fight the war on your own territory because we are too small and too vulnerable. We must take the war to the enemy's territory. That may require preemption. And in order to preempt, you have to have very good intelligence. You have to know what the enemy is about to do. You have to have very good intelligence in order to be able to mobilize your reserves and take the war to the enemy. We no longer can do that. And there is an element of Israel's military doctrine that we cannot fully implement anymore. And that has to do with rockets. The rockets of Hamas from Gaza and the rockets of Hezbollah from Lebanon. And the rockets are in many numbers, tens of thousands. And the effects of rocketry make it impossible for Israel to prevent the war from being fought in part on our own territory. And that is a serious erosion of Israel's military doctrine that it managed to preserve for decades. But in the new era of rockets and missiles, it is a lot more difficult. Facing Iran, which we will talk about a little later, means having to bear in mind that Iran's proxies, in Lebanon in particular, but also in Gaza, can inflict a huge amount of damage on Israel if Israel does decide to attack Iran for whatever reason. But what we are facing now in terms of the regional structure, the regional architecture, and the rise of powers like Iran and Turkey is what I call the crisis of the Arabs. The rise of Iran and Turkey come in the wake of this crisis of the Arabs. And if you read any of the Arabic press, if it's in the West Bank, if it's the Arabic press which appears in London or in Cairo or in the Gulf, there is this pervasive sense of crisis and failure in Arab societies. They speak of the negative effects of the Arab Spring that has brought huge damage and disarray to many of the Arab countries. The disintegration of the consensus on Israel, the demise of the Palestine National Movement, the Palestine Liberation Organization. The Arabs are adrift in the international arena. They don't have a say. No one even asked the Arabs what to do about Syria, never mind about other places. And why are the Arabs in this crisis? What are the origins of the crisis? The United Nations publishes almost annually a report which all of you who have an interest in the Middle East should have a look at. It's called the Arab Human Development Report. The Arab Human Development Report is published, as I say, almost annually by the United Nations. And it's important that it's published by the United Nations, and many of the people who write the report for the United Nations are themselves Arab scholars, economists and statisticians and political scientists. And it's a very balanced and important report of the conditions in the Arab countries. And the Arab Human Development Report speak of three deficits that the Arab states suffer from. The first is a deficit of political freedom, the lack of democratic regimes. People cannot speak freely, research freely, think freely. Second, the deficit in first world education systems. Don't have a first world university education system, nor high schools or other schools. Then the third is the lack of gender equality. That at first may seem strange. What does the lack of gender equality got to do with it? Gender equality is not just about political correctness. It's about economics. And I will explain. So if we look at the first two deficits, the lack of political freedom and the lack of first world education systems, the consequence is a society which produces very little innovation. And in the globalized high-tech world of today, countries that cannot produce technological innovation lag behind very severely from the more advanced countries. And that is the situation in the Arab countries. Israel is exactly the opposite. Israel is a startup nation. One cannot say the same about the neighborhood. And we're not talking about Israel today directly in that sense, but Israel has its own difficulty to keep itself up as a startup nation. It's very complementary to Israel that has arrived at this point. It's not so easy to stay there for a long period of time. So we have these two first deficits that are great impediments in the face of technological innovation, which is at the very heart of modern economies. And then we come to the third point, the lack of gender equality. The lack of gender equality means that women are less educated than men in many of the Arab countries. Less educated, and for reasons of tradition, for the most part, do not participate in the workforce, do not work outside the home. So you have this combination of women with lesser education who tend to have larger families. This is not only about the Middle East, this is universal. The lower education levels women have, the more children they tend to bear. And low participation in the workforce creates Arab economies that are poor performers in societies with rapidly growing populations. You don't have to be an economist to realize that this combination of poorly performing economies, very largely because half the population doesn't work, poorly performing economies with rapidly growing populations is a recipe for socio-economic disaster. The Arab states are right there. This is not a prediction about what is about to happen. We are in it. The disaster is here. This is a region that is struggling to sustain its population. The population of the Arab countries has increased in the last decade by more than 100 million. In the year 2000, there were 280 million Arabs. Today, there are more than 420 million. Unemployment amongst youth is huge. You have what one American historian called the waithood generation. That generation from 18 to 30 in the Arab countries, the waithood generation. First, there is childhood, and then there is boyhood, and then there is waithood from 18 to 30, where you simply wait. Wait for a decent education, wait for a decent job, neither of which are coming anytime soon. It's difficult for people in this age group to marry and to have families like everybody else does in the rest of the world. This is the origin of the so-called Arab Spring. The Arab Spring was not about an outburst of democracy. It was an outburst of pessimism and disillusionment and the lack of any sense of future for this generation in the struggling economies in which they exist. So the Arab countries have become arenas of civil wars, refugees, and emigration to other parts of the world if they can manage it. The number of displaced peoples in the Arab countries has gone up within a decade from around about 13 million to nearly 30 million. The Arab regions are 5.5% of the world's population, but nearly 40% of the world's refugees. The Arab states have lost hundreds of billions of dollars of GDP over the last decade through internal conflict. Oil is no longer the great stabilizer that it once was. The oil prices of 2012, for example, at their peak of $109 a barrel, dropped to about 50 and are now somewhere in between. But the Arab states, the wealthy states that have oil, are not as wealthy as they used to be. Not one single Arab state is a regional power. In the 50s or the 60s, you could name a few. Egypt, first and foremost. Iraq, Syria, Saudi Arabia. None of these, including Saudi Arabia, is a regional power. Saudi Arabia is not as wealthy as it once was. Saudi Arabia doesn't have the military power that can really influence regional events. The Saudis for 7 years now have been fighting a losing war in Yemen. Not itself a great regional power. But the Saudis couldn't have their way in Yemen, and they haven't had their way in hardly any regional issues, not to mention the rising power of Iran, for which the Saudis have no answer. The Saudis, in their weakness, did not join the Abraham Accords, probably out of fear of taking an outward position towards Israel. The Saudis have great plans for 2030 to establish an economy independent of oil. And as you read the press these days, coming from Saudi Arabia and other places, there is ever increasing doubt of whether the Saudis will ever meet that timetable of 2030. And the fact that oil prices are now a bit higher is even reason for the Saudis to delay the post-fossil fuel era. Some predicted that the situation in the Arab countries was so dire that the Arab states would begin to fall apart. Well, they do have serious domestic problems of cohesion, but they have not fallen apart. But the authoritarian regimes of the Arab states have lost a lot of their authority. And there are in some Arab states, quite a few, one can mention Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon, and Yemen, and Libya, that have what they call sovereignty vacuums, that the state is not entirely in control of all of its territory. So this Arab weakness, this Arab crisis, leads to the emergence of the preeminence of the non-Arab powers, Turkey and Iran. Why were they more successful? They were more successful. These are very large states, huge territories, 80 million people apiece. States that are not recent creations. They weren't created by the imperial powers after the First World War, like Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, etc. Turkey and Iran have been around as sovereign states, indeed empires, for centuries. They have a domestic cohesion not only based on long histories of sovereign independence, as I say, for centuries. They have a domestic cohesion based on languages of their own. The Turks speak Turkish, the Iranians speak Persian, and they have a religion of their own. The Turks are Sunni Muslims like the Arabs are, but the Iranians are Shiite Muslims, a different branch of Islam, which is dominated by Iran in the Middle East region. just to compare with the past, to give an example of how this Arab weakness is reflected in current affairs. In the late 1950s, Syria, which has always been a difficult state to run because of its domestic sectarian divisions within it, it's not a homogeneous population, but rather a heterogeneous population in terms of religious sectarianism. Syria was on the verge of political collapse in the late 1950s and was collected by Egypt and united with Egypt in what was then called the United Arab Republic. Syria recently has fallen again into domestic crisis. But the pieces were picked up not by Egypt, but by Russia and by Turkey and Iran. The Arabs aren't even there. Nobody even asked them. And the origin of this decline goes back many years. I spoke about the United Arab Republic in 1958. That was the pinnacle of Arab nationalist success. But from there, it was all downhill. The United Arab Republic broke up in 1961. In 1962, the civil war began in Yemen, which became Egypt's Vietnam. They sent troops there to fight in the civil war and created their Vietnam of their own. And then came the horrific defeat to Israel in 1967. And the horrific defeat in 1967 showed up Arab nationalism as presented by Egypt and Abdel Nasser as an empty vessel. If Abdel Nasser and Arab nationalism were supposed to provide the Arabs with the power and the prestige and the prosperity of a great international force, all of this came to naught in 1967. It was shown up as being a vacuum. Arab nationalism was not the wave of the future, as so many people expected in the 1950s. But this was not just a failure of Arab nationalism. It was not just a failure of a political movement. Arab nationalism was a secular idea. Arab nationalism, that is, defining a nation on the basis of the language they speak, is a European idea. The Germans speak German and have a country called Germany. And the French speak French and have a country called France. And Arab nationalism was a European idea adopted by the Arabs in the late 19th and early 20th century. It was a secular idea. And Arabism and Arab nationalism was the platform of secularization because it united the people on the basis of the language they spoke and not their religion. In the Middle East, for centuries upon centuries, people defined themselves not by the language they spoke, but by their religious belief. You were either a Muslim or a Christian or a Jew. And Muslims who were either Sunni or Shia, and Christians who were either Catholic or Greek Orthodox, and variety of other Christian denominations. The idea of Arab nationalism was also the secularization of the Arabs, Muslims and Christians together as speakers of the Arabic language. But if this secularizing platform crashed in 1967, it was replaced by political Islam. And political Islam was the natural inheritor of the Arab nationalist failure. Culture matters. Tradition is a lot more resilient than people think. And when Arab nationalism proved to be a failure, it was the Islamists who cashed in. And they could come and in full force say, "We told you so." This idea of defining ourselves like the Europeans do on the basis of language is not the way we, the Muslims, have done things in our history. We should go back to our authentic identity, which is our religious identity, not the language we speak. We are a community of believers, not the speakers of a certain language. If it is political Islam that we are returning to, this is very divisive in the Arab world. Arab nationalism was intended to unite all speakers of the Arabic language, irrespective of their religious beliefs. Christians and Muslims, in theory, were one. All Arabs, all speakers of the Arabic language. If it wasn't for the Arab-Israeli conflict, they could have included Jewish speakers of the Arabic language in this grand Arab nationalist movement too. But if we're speaking about political Islam, it's back to the old divisions. Sunnis versus Shiites, the different branches of Islam. Muslims versus Christians. And Christians of their various denominations. And then smaller splinter sects that have broken away from Islam, like the Druze or the Alawites, who are the present-day rulers of Syria. Sectarianism began to undermine the cohesion of many Arab states. Lebanon is a country of minorities. There is no majority in Lebanon. It's just a mosaic of minorities. Syria has a majority, but there are many minorities. Iraq too is a country of different sects, Sunnis and Shiites, and we will come back to that shortly. Actually, Jordan, which many people have always thought is potentially very unstable and is a very artificial creation, Jordan has proved to be more stable than all these countries. And the reason why Jordan has proved to be more stable than all these countries, as opposed to what many people expected, was because Jordan is not a mosaic of minorities. Jordan is a country composed of more than 90% Sunni Muslim speakers of the Arabic language, not a mosaic of minorities like Syria, Lebanon, and Iraq. So we speak of Islamic politics, Islamic radicalism. But there are very many kinds of Islamic radicalism. And there are two major sources of Islamic radicalism: the Sunni brand of Islamic radicalism and the Shiite brand of Islamic radicalism. And they differ. They have different emphases in their doctrines. And these different emphases have strategic political consequences, as we will see. The Sunnis believe that the only legitimate societies can be societies governed by Islamic law. For a society to be legitimate, the Sunni radicals argue, the society must be based on Islamic law. If it is not based on Islamic law, it is not a legitimate society. But there is no papacy in Islam. In Sunni Islam, there is no pope, there is no central authority. There are hundreds, if not thousands, of organizations and militias who all have their own brand of Sunni Islam radical interpretation of the reality. At times, the civil war in Syria, because of the multitude of organizations fighting against each other, Syria looked like the Hobbesian war of all against all. So the Sunni world, in its division between the various brands of radicalism, is deeply divided within itself, which weakens the Sunni world even further. But if we look at the Shiite version of Islamic radicalism, it doesn't put the same emphasis on the implementation of Islamic law. Not that it's not important for them, of course it is. But Shiite radicalism emphasizes the personality of the ruler. Not the implementation of the law, but the person of the ruler. And the ruler must be a man of religion. It is the rule of the jurisconsult, the rule of the expert in religious law. That is Khomeini. That is the leader, the religious leader of Iran. And the religious leader of Iran, Khomeini and Khamenei, and whoever comes after them, are implementing this idea of the rule of the jurisprudent. And they do have a centralized authority and a centralized political leadership. It sits in Tehran. And therefore Shiites throughout the Middle East, not all of them, not all would agree with this interpretation. Some don't accept this notion of the rule of the jurisprudent, but the majority do. And they, the Shiites of Iraq, and the Shiites of Yemen, and the Shiites of Lebanon, look to Tehran, look to the regime in Tehran as their political and religious authority. So Iran has a doctrinarial advantage over the Sunnis in the struggle for influence. They have an influential, accepted center of power, which the Sunnis don't have. So deeply divided amongst themselves, the Shiites are less so. And then comes the American invasion of Iraq in 2003, which was a disaster of such proportion that one cannot believe that they ever went into this exercise. Saddam Hussein was an evil man. Of that, there is no doubt. But Iraq under Saddam Hussein was Iraq ruled by the Sunni Arab minority in Iraq. They were the gatekeepers to the Arab East, keeping Iran out. The removal of Saddam Hussein empowered the Shiite majority in Iraq, turning Iraq from the gatekeeper keeping Iran out into an Iranian Shiite azor of influence, inviting the Iranians in. So instead of having Iraq keeping the Iranians out of other parts of the Middle East, the Iranians now sit happily as a major influence in Iraq, in Syria next door, and in Lebanon they have Hezbollah, which is the militia of the Shiite minority in Lebanon. The Shiite minority in Lebanon is the largest minority in Lebanon. And the Iranians now have regional influence from Tehran to the Mediterranean, the likes of which they've never had in the modern era. So the region is no longer divided as it once was between Arabs, Turks, and Iranians. There's been a recodification of the political language. It's now a region divided between Sunni Muslims, and Shiite Muslims, and all the other various religious sects. And where is Israel in all of this? Israel is no longer alone against the rest. That's how it used to be. Now, with Sunni versus Shia, Iran versus the Arabs, the alliance of Sunni countries of anxiety, I call them, versus Iran is very much on Israel's side. They look to Israel to back them up versus Iran. So Israel is no longer against everybody else on its own, far from it. It has allies, and numerous allies. The Arab-Israeli conflict, the old conflict, is essentially over. There is the Palestinian issue of great importance, and I don't shunt that aside at all. But the interstate conflict, the conflict between Israel and the Arab states, is over. Once Egypt made peace with Israel in the late 1970s, the other Arab states didn't have the power to fight Israel on their own. And the Arab-Israeli conflict essentially has been over for nearly 50 years in practice. The Abraham Accords reinforce this picture of peace with Israel. And they come from beyond the old zone of conflict. We were never in conflict directly with the Gulf states that concluded the Abraham Accords with Israel. But the Abraham Accords, I fear, are being a little oversold. Indeed, they offer normalization between Israel and the UAE, the United Arab Emirates, and with Bahrain and Morocco and Sudan. But this cannot come instead of serious engagement with the Palestinians at all levels. And if it was sold as that, that is unrealistic. So what are the Abraham Accords? What do they offer? Certainly economic and political cooperation in various ways and means, but ostensibly it's an alliance against Iran. But as the US steps back from the front line in the Middle East, pivoting its main focus elsewhere, the local players like Saudi Arabia and the United Arab Emirates are very reluctant to take on Iran. And the more the US steps back, so the Saudis and the UAE, while contacting Israel, also play on the other side of the court with Iran. They seek no aggravation of the relationship with Iran. And therefore, there is no real united front in the Gulf against Iran. And there are limitations on what Israel can expect from these signatories of the Abraham Accords in a confrontation with Iran. So what are Israel's options when it comes to dealing with Iran? If the Arabs are no longer Israel's major concern, and Iran is this major challenge to Israel, what are Israel's options? And before I say what Israel's options are, I would ask if perhaps there aren't alternative approaches to Iran. We, for many years, have said that Iran is a radical, religiously motivated state out to attack Israel, perhaps with nuclear weapons to destroy Israel. That, of course, is quite possible. But Iran is also a country that has a long historical paranoia of foreign intervention in Iran's business. And therefore, there is also the possibility that Iran is seeking regional influence to keep foreign intervention out of Iran, rather than seeking to dominate the region and necessarily come into conflict directly with Israel. And I think that it would be a good idea not only to prepare for a possible confrontation with Iran, but also perhaps to look for ways and means of perhaps getting into some kind of negotiation, discussion, if not directly, then indirectly, with Iran about what it is that they really intend to achieve. It's difficult to think that the Iranians really want to destroy Israel by nuclear attack. Hardly much would be left of Iran too if they were to do so. And I'm sure that is something they have to consider. In the meantime, Israel is trying to contain Iran's regional influence by restricting Iran's freedom of movement in Syria. Israel does carry out military operations in Syria every now and then, but it is constrained in doing so by the Russians who are present in Syria, as we know only too well. And though the Russians don't see eye to eye with Iran on everything, they're not about to push the Iranians out on Israel's behalf. So the Iranians are still there in Syria, and they also have certain advantages that they have attained in Lebanon, especially via their proxy Hezbollah, which is the most powerful militia in Lebanon. Indeed, such a powerful militia that it's far more powerful than the Lebanese army. And there is, of course, a danger that if there is to be an agreement with Iran, and Iran becomes a post-sanctions Iran, that Lebanon, as weak as it is in huge economic crisis, may become a Hezbollah-controlled protectorate of Iran, which would be a threat to Israel more than it is now, and nothing much that the other Arabs, the Saudis, or the whole Sunni camp could really do about it. Economic and political pressures are very high on Iran. Sanctions have been imposed on Iran since the regime in Iran came to power over 40 years ago. If I am a believer in sanctions bringing down the Iranian regime, I doubt it. It hasn't worked over the last 41 years, and I don't think it's going to work anytime soon either. A word about Israel and Turkey. In our difficult relationship with Iran, to put it mildly, Israel for many years had an outstanding relationship with Turkey. Israel and Turkey were strategic allies. But Turkey has changed. And Turkey has, in the last 20 years, under the rule of President Erdogan, Turkey has undergone a historical metamorphosis. Turkey was once one of the most secular countries in the Middle East, if not the most secular. The consequence of the secularizing revolution of Mustafa Kemal Atatürk, the creation of the new Turkish Republic in the 1920s. But Turkey is now a country, and has been for 20 years, under an Islamist party, Erdogan's party, the AKP. And the AKP has pivoted Turkey away from its traditional alliance with NATO, with the European Union, and with the United States. And as Turkey shifts away from the West, it becomes a major player in the Arab and Muslim world. If it is not pivoting towards Europe, it's looking in the other direction, which is back to the Arab world and the Muslim world, where the Turks feel very much at home, more at home than they do in Brussels. And as Turkey moves away from the West, so its relationship with Israel becomes more difficult. When Turkey was pivoting towards the West, Israel and Turkey had a lot in common. Secular countries that had powerful secular political elites that were in control, that had one foot in the Middle East and one foot in Europe. This is no longer true. And the elites in Turkey have changed. And Turkey has 2 feet in the Middle East and very little presence in Europe of the old days. And as a result, Israel and Turkey have drifted apart. There is now talk of a reunification of, or the resumption of, the old relationship with Turkey. Israel's relations with Turkey may very well improve. I have very little belief in these relations becoming what they were in the 1990s. So to end with one last comment, what is left of this term Middle East? I would say not much. I don't think the term Middle East really is a good analytical term of the region as we know it today. The term Middle East is a colonial term, and it comes from the colonial era at the beginning of the 20th century, when the Middle East was seen as the Middle East from Washington, London, and Paris. If you live in the Middle East, it's not the middle or the east of anything. It's only the Middle East if it's that place which is on the way to the Far East, if you are sitting in Washington, London, and Paris. So it's a name that was given to the region by foreigners. It was the Middle East that was the Arab world. And as we started, I mentioned just how the Middle East is no longer the Arab world. The Arab-Israeli conflict used to be the centerpiece of this Middle East Arab world, and the Arab-Israeli conflict isn't there anymore either. So I would say it would be much more relevant today to speak about the Middle East divided into 4 basic subdivisions: North Africa, the Eastern Mediterranean, the Levant, and the Gulf. The Eastern Mediterranean is Israel's natural habitat, with some Arab states and some non-Arab states like us. Israel will never be part of the Arab world, and Israel will not be part of the Muslim world. But Israel is an integral part of the Eastern Mediterranean, with countries like Egypt on the one hand, with whom we have peace, and with countries who are not Arabs, like Cyprus and Greece, and maybe Turkey again. So Israel's place, I would say, in the region, further down the road, also because of resources, gas, and cooperating on the transport of gas to Europe with countries that are also part of the Eastern Mediterranean. That is where I would put Israel's longer-term future, rather than a profound relationship with the Arab countries that are in such deep crisis. So thank you for your patience, and I welcome Q&A.
Professor Susser, thank you so much for this very enlightening, bringing us up to date in terms of where things are today. In fact, I have one question that I would like to ask to start. As we see the Iranian influence coming into the Eastern Mediterranean, into Lebanon and Syria and so on, and bumping up against Turkey, the borders with Turkey, could you speak a bit about this interaction between the Turks and the Iranians as they have this, not a confrontation necessarily, but they are bumping up against each other in their interests?
Well, I think that if we look back over the long historical record, the Ottoman Empire and the Persian Empire did occasionally fight with each other, but usually they had other enemies. And the Ottomans were preoccupied mainly fighting enemies in Europe. And I don't think the Turks and the Iranians, although they have different interests, they're not on the same page on regional issues necessarily. They are not mortal enemies either. And both of them, big countries, do not look to confront each other. The Turks do not see themselves as leading the Sunni world against the Iranians, and the Iranians don't see themselves as setting up the Turks as their major enemies. So I think it would be difficult to count on a Turkish-Iranian competition, let's say, to reduce Iranian influence in the region. It hasn't worked until now, and I don't think the Turks are looking to play a role of that kind.
You know, another question related to this: Egypt was a leader, in a sense, in the 1950s into the early 60s, and it's made peace with Israel. But Egypt, how does Egypt play into the Arab world today?
Well, I would say, first of all, I think the Egyptians do take their leadership role seriously. They do want to see other Arab states looking up to them. They see themselves, as they call themselves, the mother of the universe. They are a greater country than all the other Arab states. They are a country that has a very long history as opposed to all the other Arab states. But Egypt is a very poor country. And Egypt is a country going through a demographic crisis, the end of which I cannot tell. The Egyptian population grows by 1 million people every 6 months. This is something that Egypt cannot sustain.
Yeah.
And they have passed the 100 million mark, and it's going up at a pace. Egypt is running out of water. Ethiopia is creating a huge dam on the Nile in Ethiopia, and this may lead to some kind of confrontation between Egypt and Ethiopia over water. So the Egyptians are facing, I would say, a very tough internal position, which reduces their regional clout. They are too preoccupied in keeping themselves afloat. Even take the Ukrainian crisis right now. The Egyptians buy a huge amount of their wheat from the Ukraine. If they don't get wheat from somewhere else, the Egyptians are going to have a serious problem feeding their population in a few weeks' time. These are the kinds of issues that the Egyptians deal with. Being a great regional power and organizing the region is beyond their capabilities these days. The best they can do, and the best that they do, and is very important for Israel, is dealing with Hamas in Gaza. Egypt does make it easier for Israel to contain the problem of Gaza. And the Egyptians are very helpful with that, for the most part. And in that, they are very important for Israel. But as regional movers and shakers like Egypt was in the 1950s, those are days gone and not to be retrieved.
There's a question from Paul Golding about how does Iran avoid the three failures of the UN Human Development Report that you spoke to in terms of the Arab world, the Sunni world? Isn't Iran affected by these as much as the Arab states?
Not to the same degree. Not to the same degree. And it's very interesting, and I think it has something to do with the difference between Shia and Sunni. Shia has always been, I would say, less doctrinaire, more open to change, even though we tend to focus on the fact that there are Shiite suicide bombers. That is not a good representation of what Shia has been over the years. The Iranians have relatively good universities. They have very good participation of women in higher education. Iran has a well-educated scientific elite, and you can see that by the nuclear program. Iran has always been sending thousands of its students to the West to study, particularly to the US, by the way. And these people have come back to Iran with very good qualifications. And as a result, Iran is a category unto itself and doesn't suffer from the same kind of analysis that the Arab Human Development Report has done on the Arab states. By the way, Turkey is also different because Turkey has had a long secular tradition. And Turkey still has, although I'm not so sure that it will remain if they continue going in the direction they are, still has a good higher education system. So in that respect, Iran is, I would say, the way ahead of the Arab states and is indeed in a category unto itself. And you can see that both in their scientific production and in their nuclear program.
There are multiple questions that deal with Palestinians. And to summarize, how should Israel view the Palestinians from a strategic point of view?
Well, I'll talk about that next time in greater detail. But what I will say now is that we are an ideological project, if we talk about ourselves, Israel. We are the nation state of the Jewish people. To remain the nation state of the Jewish people, we must preserve a very strong Jewish majority. And to do that, we will have to think of some kind of arrangement with the Palestinians in the not too distant future. Not because they're necessarily as peaceful as we would want them to be, but simply because Israel cannot continue to rule over millions of Palestinians and remain the nation state of the Jewish people and a legitimate member of the family of nations. We have always desired to be both of these, the nation state of the Jewish people and the legitimate member of the family of nations. And continuing to control millions of Palestinians under Israeli occupation, like in the West Bank, and very tight control over Gaza, is, I think, difficult for Israel to maintain forever. And we're going to have to think of other ways of dealing with this. And therefore, I do think that it's in Israel's own self-interest, and mainly, I would say, in the self-interest of the great idea on which we have been founded, to preserve Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. We have to take into consideration that we have certain limitations. It would have been great if all the Jewish people were in Israel, but as we know, they are not. And therefore, we have limitations. And we have to take these limitations into account.
Don Goldstein asks, do you see any difference in regional policies between the present Israeli government and the previous one?
Oh, yes, I do. If the previous government is the Netanyahu government, yes, there is a difference. And the difference is that this government is more forthcoming when it comes to dealing with the neighbors. It seems to be, let's say, less ideological. For example, I give the key relations between Israel and Jordan. which the Jordanian king would not speak to Netanyahu, never mind seeing. He wouldn't take his calls. Since the Netanyahu government has been replaced, the Israeli leadership is meeting regularly with the Jordanians. We have new deals with them on water. We have new arrangements with them over the long term of possibly exchanging solar energy that will come from Jordan in exchange for water that will come from Israel. We don't have a water problem because of our desalination program, which has more or less put our water problem very much under control. So our relations with the neighborhood are indeed better. And the same is true of our relations with Egypt. Because this government seems to be more flexible when it comes to relations with the Arabs, generally speaking. And as a result, our relationship with Jordan and Egypt is better than it was. We may be improving relations with Turkey, as we see now. Our relations with the European Union are much better. And as a result, things have changed. Indeed, they have.
Another question from Anna Klenicki. She asks about how the role of the religious observance, religious rite in Israel, how would you compare that in terms of the political Islamization in the Arab worlds?
Well, there are certain similarities, but there are also major differences. I think the religious parties in Israel, at least, do not have a militant philosophy about Judaizing the secular Jews, or the non-religious Jews. The Islamists have a whole platform of Islamizing the rest of society. Secondly, the use of force. These are not parts of the philosophy of the religious Jews, but there is a certain similarity when it comes to the place of religious law in the constitution. We don't have a formal constitution. Israel has no constitution, but the religious parties argue for a greater measure of implementation of religious law in conducting daily Israeli matters, as do the Islamists in the Muslim countries. So there are similarities, but there are also major differences. They're not the same in every respect.
Professor Susher, thank you for this. Would you mind to give just a brief foretelling of what your talk will be about in March?
In March, I will be speaking about Israel and the Palestinians. And what I will be speaking about is why is it that with the Palestinians we have failed so miserably to achieve a peaceful settlement, when with other Arab neighbors who are potentially much stronger and more influential, we have succeeded in making peace. Jordan and Egypt, for example. So why is there this big difference between Israel and the Arab states with whom we make peace, and with the Palestinians who don't even have a state, we haven't been able to do so? So why is there this huge difference? And once I've explained why there is this huge difference, I will suggest what it is that we should do about it. And how do we go about establishing some kind of modus vivendi in this very complicated situation? Because I would argue that for Israel to achieve full and final peace with the Palestinians is beyond reach. We see ourselves as the epitome of historical justice. They see us as the epitome of historical injustice and aggression. These narratives just don't meet. So I don't think that we're going to make a final peace agreement. But the question is, between having no peaceful agreement and a final peace agreement, if there is something in the middle, some halfway house, where we can arrive at some kind of modus vivendi that they and we can live with without solving all the problems. Solving all the problems, I think, is beyond our capacity. But making life livable for them and for us, I think, is not impossible. And it is a question of defining what it is that we're capable of reaching and to aim for that, rather than just sitting back and saying that there is no possibility for a solution and leaving things as they are. Because leaving things as they are, I would argue, for Israel is the worst of all options. because then we glide into gliding into a one-state solution. A one-state solution in which the Arabs will eventually be the majority. And if the Arabs do eventually become the majority, what's left for us? I mean, what's the idea? The whole idea is about creating a Jewish state that has a Jewish majority. If there's an Arab majority, what are we doing? Where is the reason for our existence? It's a real dilemma. On the one hand, withdrawal is dangerous. On the other hand, not withdrawing is equally dangerous. So it's not as if we have an easy discussion about good and evil. We have to choose between a variety of very difficult alternatives. It's a complicated story. And that's what I will be trying to explain in my next talk.
Thank you very much for this today. And we look forward to seeing you the 20th of March.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Also, thank you, Asher.
Thank you very much.
Rishat Shalom.
Toda.